the most One of the most important things that I want you to get from this presentation is that you all will have to be the leads in planning and preparing for the future. So there's a whole bunch of DEI people that are really looking at this work from the perspective of past injustices or even current behaviors that are inappropriate and unprofessional. But one of the things that makes you all unique is that you were here to think about the future of this work. And this is where we want to be proactive and not really lead from behind, but lead from the front. One of the things that we're going to do today is break into small breakout groups because I want us to really think about how to really communicate some of these things within your organization and not just look at it like this is information that you're collecting. I want you to do something with this information. One is I want you to think big. I want you to think as big as you possibly can. But the second thing that I want you to do with this information is I want you to be proactive, not where you are kind of waiting to see how things progress, but you're engaging in the right kind of conversations that will essentially ensure that your organization can prevent some things from happening. I'm going to talk about a lot of different examples, and hopefully some of these examples will resonate with you. So there has been a rapid progression of the use of technology. And I want you all to kind of liken this progression from like the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. So in the 1980s, we began to see the creation of a new position. And that position generally had the title of a chief technology officer. This is a relatively new role that we previously didn't have. Some of you, if you've been working in the information technology space or IT space for a long time, you remember what it was like in 1999 when there was corporate chaos, right? So every organization in the world was literally fearful that the world would end or stop at December 31st, 11:59 p.m. on in the year 1999. So they were just like, the world's going to end, and it was just pandemonium, right? So once the clocks changed to 2000, everyone said, woof. Now let's start talking about the future. And this is where we begin to see more of a focus on relationship management, customer relationship management, data processing. We begin to use email a lot more. And then as we looked at the next decade, we saw online marketing, social media, touchscreen devices. We see a generation of young people, Generation Z, who are born completely immersed in technology. So much so that they are really redefining today's workforce, right? I'm going to talk more about that. As we look at this next era in 2020, we see much more integration. And certainly, again, comparing it to the DEI function, the diversity, equity, and inclusion officer role is a relatively new role, right? And as we have progressed in this area, we're no longer focusing on just affirmative action and preventing lawsuits. Now we have more organizations that are talking about integration. And certainly, that's going to be one of the future pieces and the cornerstone of what we're going to talk about today. But we're going to look at a lot of different things. And one of the big things is that we have to talk about some of the trends in this new normal. So we've seen a lot more artificial intelligence and technology. And again, I'm going to use a lot of examples. Everything from when you go to wash your hands at in a washroom and there's a sink where you don't have to touch anything. That's all automation, and it's based on sometimes the um, technology detecting that there is something, an object, perhaps a person's hands under the sink. Now, some of those sinks have made are based on algorithms based on perhaps one skin color. So for those of us who have darker skin, we may put our hands under the sink and the water does not start immediately, right? So that comes as a result of perhaps sometimes the programming, and I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. We also see more discussions around globalization. And the idea that we are in a global economy. So I want you to imagine this. We have this whole great resignation and people at the same time, decision makers at organizations, they are deciding to lay off people. And what may happen is the inadvertent creation of, I'll say, entrepreneurs. People who had a dream of doing their own thing. You know, they were already kind of doing their own thing as a gig worker on the side for many, many years. And some of them are reimagining their work. And this is also driving a strong push for entrepreneurship. Globalization is not just the fact that we can communicate with people from all over the world and there's transportation options. Globalization implies that there are more choices. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Another big issue is the pace of change. The pandemic has accelerated the rate of change. And what that means is that for all of those organizations that have mastered the skill of change management during the DEI revolution, we have seen that those organizations are more agile when it comes to talking about change. You don't have as many people resisting change. And certainly along that line is the whole idea of organizations saying, hey, you know what? We see some things going on differently, right? We see shifting behaviors, expectations, attitudes, and needs, what I'll call the beans. And this goes to the organization's brand as well, right? So some organizations are saying, hey, we're on the cusp of, you know, all these great and wonderful things, but yet when it comes to the workforce, we are going to take some shortcuts. What do you mean, Leah? I mean, a couple of years ago, when the pandemic first started, we had airlines that laid off uh, numerous people, right? And when they laid off all of those folks, they had the expectation that, you know, things are going to be slow for a while, and certainly things were. But when the economy picked up and people just started traveling, and all of a sudden we had this boom in people saying, hey, I need to get out the house, right? So I need to travel. Those same airlines were now at a disadvantage because they couldn't staff up quick enough to deal with the change in behaviors. And this is a risk that every organization currently faces, not planning for these beans, right? The expectation is, hey, when I want to travel, you're going to be able to accommodate my needs right now, right? The attitude is, hey, you know what? This whole travel thing and getting out the house, it's necessary. But many airlines have been unable to meet the needs or the demands of the customers because they made decisions in the beginning of the pandemic that had an impact on their current reality. And certainly, this is where we have to really get our organizations to dive into what it means to have purpose, right? What our organization is, what our organization stands for, what's our culture. This has been driving the great resignation because we have a whole generation of people that are saying, you know what, I'm going to quit this job and I don't have another job lined up, but I'm going to quit this job because certainly there is not there's not a strong connection between the organizational culture and my life, right? And I want there to be alignment. And certainly this has come at a time when people have been rethinking their lives during this change, right? The change where we see more caregivers, whether it's people caring for their children, people caring for their parents, or for others who may be relatives. We see more of a focus on accessibility, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, as well as people working from home. And again, the expectation, going back to these expectations, the expectation is, hey, we were able to successfully and productively work from home. That should mean that we ought to continue to do it. Right. And there are a lot of people who have said, hey, I hate working from home. Please let me back into the office so I can be around people. Right. But there is that expectation that there's going to be some flexibility. And all these things mean that the organization and its management have to employ new skills, right? So I saw an article a couple of years ago that talked about, or a couple of months ago, that talked about how some of the management paradigms from the 1980s are no longer relevant. Yes, we're in 2022. And certainly when it comes to issues like fair pay, work life, work at home, all those things are topics that Generation Z is talking about on social media. If you haven't logged on to TikTok, make sure that you get on a TikTok. They're not just dancing on TikTok. There is information that is being conveyed in 1 minute or less, and people are learning. And certainly it is up to us to start looking at what they are learning. All right, so there are some relevant terms that we should understand. Is anyone familiar with any of these terms here? If so, what are these terms? What are these terms? You can either use the chat feature or you can come off chat to talk about what these terms are.
Hi, everyone. Got my morning voice here. I'm on the West Coast. I do recognize some of these terms. Yeah. So I think someone answered artificial intelligence, machine learning, augmented reality, virtual reality, metaverse, very, very versed in that. My husband is in the NFT space. So it's all about the metaverse, which is that place that only exists in the computers, but it feels like real life at times. And then I can let some other folks answer the rest.
Okay.
I was going to answer that. I recognize all of them, but I'm afraid to say that because I don't know what your next question is going to be.
Well, you know what my next question is going to be. Define them.
Yeah, so that I don't know any of them. But I think I'm most familiar with the algorithmic bias. There's a really great Netflix show that talked about it. I don't remember it, but it was talks literally about bias in technology, particularly for people of color. So that was when I learned more about that.
Okay.
And I also agree with what everybody else has been saying. The algorithmic bias and design flaws definitely, basically my understanding is that those two items are how the new landscape of technology isn't actually serving all customers the same way or all stakeholders the same way. And of course, the metaverse, which everybody is kind of holding their breath for its impact on the way that we live our lives, the way that we even work. I see that companies are even buying up all this property in the metaverse, where just like we have the expectation of remote flexibility now, companies are thinking when this metaverse really has full impact, employees are going to want to work from the metaverse, not just remotely. They're gonna want you to build out an avatar for them, and this is my new work life experience.
Right. Who else? Anyone else familiar with any of these terms?
We have some in the chat. Can we read them?
Okay. Yes.
We have virtual reality, artificial intelligence, machine learning, virtual reality again, metaversa is digital world. We have someone say, I'm familiar with all, but not deeply. And that's pretty much it in the chat.
Okay. So I had a call a couple of weeks ago from a young lady who asked me about accessibility. She worked with the federal government, and she said there was a new focus on accessibility, and she wasn't quite sure what that term meant. And many of us have heard of accessibility, and I'm going to give you an example of what that means in a little bit, but certainly it is a step in design, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, but it's a step in design that would basically give forethought into the fact that there are people who have different abilities or disabilities. And certainly, the difference between accessibility and accommodation is that an accommodation is something that you request on a one-on-one basis. And certainly after you make that request, it is up to the organization to consider that request and determine whether or not to give it to you. And it can lead to discrimination. Accessibility is different because it is something that if you do it right, will not require an accommodation, right? It's designed to really support the masses regardless of their different abilities. And it allows them to use technology in a way that's inclusive. And certainly it is the next generation of really thinking about disability, right, and inclusion. This idea of design flaws is something I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about. But essentially, a design flaw can arise when you have an individual or an organization that is really using its technology or developing technology in a way that certainly they're not considering all of the possibilities. And I'm going to talk about how that can happen. But sometimes this issue of a design flaw can happen for a variety of different reasons, including an outdated approach to design. And it results in deficiency or an oversight. And certainly sometimes it results in an oversight because people are excited about all the bells and whistles. I mean, when you think about technology, lots of folks get excited about the fact that you have Brandis gave an example when we are talking about accessibility, virtual, she said visibility technology on the web page, having a virtual ASL interpreter. ASL is American Sign Language, talk to text ability, and certainly your iPhone has that ability, or your cell phone has that ability to do talk to text. Ayana said that accessibility is preemptive universal design. So that means that, again, we're putting systems, as Brandis added, systems in place that support individuals who are differently abled or have disabilities. So certainly, as we're talking about all these different things, we have to begin to make it so that we are understanding some of these terms that we may hear and not just kind of let them go over our head. We have cell phones, right? Let's use those cell phones to look up the terms that we hear so that we can really understand the terms and understand some of the processes that go in here. And I'm going to talk about why we should do that. So before we get into the whys and the hows and the all those different things, I want to talk about how machines learn. Right? So there are several different ways that machines can learn. And this is where we can have those, what I'll call design flaws. So one of the ways that machines learn is through experience. And certainly the experience can come from issues such as data, and the data can be programmed into a system, and certainly the data set that is used can be perhaps outdated, or it can be what we'll call flawed. So an example of that would be, some of you may have heard a couple of years ago when you had one of the assistant programs that was trying to teach itself how to, communicate and interact with different people. And one of the things that happened is that the system learned through experience how to use the N-word and how to call Black people, in particular monkeys. And this was not the intent of the designers, the people who constructed the program, but it was what the machine learned. And certainly the company had to shut that system down because, again, people learned, that the machine learned to equate Black people with the N-word and with monkeys. And certainly, one of the other ways that a machine learns is through task. The machine can solve tasks like predicting future sales, right? So one of the things that we're going to talk about is the prediction mode and how it has resulted in a lot of challenges for organizations when we're talking about things like the environment. Another way that the machine learns is through performance. And the performance addresses things like accuracy and providing prediction as well as bias issues. So assuming that E is past historical data by which a machine is learning, you can imagine how critical the data is in its quality. So the data is going to be the building block and the main driver for solving machine learning problems. It's certainly a longstanding definition of data emphasizes the role that it has in representing facts about the world. So we're in a time period or an era where people are kind of confusing facts with reality, with I'll say lies or stretches of the truth, right? So certainly, this is a problem when we're talking about machine learning and how a machine is going to learn. Because again, if the data set is faulty, it can result in other bad things happening when it comes to this data. Your data is going to be stored in digital form. And certainly, when we're talking about this data, it's an asset, right? It's an asset because it produces information that gives your organization insight about customers, products, services. From our perspective, from the DEI perspective, we may also have additional insight about people, right? In particular, people who we employ, as well as people who we serve or people who are users of our programs. So we want to make a distinction between data and information. Certainly, the concepts are intertwined and dependent on each other, but data is a form of information, and also information also happens to be a form of data. Now, as we're looking at this issue, there are lots of challenges when it comes to data management. Certainly, one of the challenges relates to data valuation. For instance, as we're calculating things like looking at assets like stocks or calculating value, that can be a little easy unless, for instance, the value is related to something that comes from what I'll call a faulty data set. So let's say we're talking about someone's home valuation. You could do all of the upgrades that you want in your home, and you can make your home just like new, but the valuation of your home may be low because of the zip code or the neighborhood. And this is a problem, especially as we're talking about home ownership and why some individuals are not getting the proper valuation for their homes, because their zip code is based on discriminatory information based on, the fact that the person is perhaps Black or the person is Latino or the person is XYZ. This has also resulted in organizations like Wells Fargo. Some of you may have seen the news articles where Wells Fargo rejected half of its applicants during the mortgage refinancing boom. You have fewer than half of those Black applicants who were approved by the biggest bank mortgage lender. And certainly one of the things that Wells Fargo said was, hey, we don't have people involved in those decisions. You know who's involved in the decisions? Our technology, our algorithms. That is what is making the decision. So therefore, regardless of how much money you make, regardless of how good your credit is, our algorithms are set in a way where you will be denied a mortgage simply because of the fact that you are perhaps purchasing a home in a neighborhood or refinancing a home in a neighborhood that is in a predominantly Black neighborhood, regardless of the income. And again, that is a challenge, because when these types of stories are released to the media, it results not only in lawsuits, but it also results in a public relations nightmare. So we have to be aware of some of these things that can happen, especially as our machines learn, and they're learning based on a data set that could be faulty. So one of the challenges that we have as we're talking about all these different things is the fact that we can't, as DEI leaders, we can't just walk into a room and say, hey, you don't know what you're doing, right? And you don't know what you don't know, right? Because this is why two of the most important areas in the future of work do not necessarily get along too well. Those two areas are diversity and technology, right? As we look at the future of the workplace, there's not a whole lot of interaction, right? So, you have the diversity people who say technology people don't know what they're doing, and you have the technology people that say diversity folks don't know what they're talking about, right? They don't know what they're doing. So you have to, Frank, you noted it very well here. People set the parameters, people have biases and projects that are related to those parameters as well. So one of the things that we want to make sure is that when we're dealing with the people who are programming bias into systems or responsible for evaluating whether or not bias is present, that we are approaching the conversation with the right perspective, and we are providing education for those individuals that we're working with as it relates to accessibility, representation, things like testing and validation, even in terms of linguistic bias. So certainly we may not even be aware of how linguistic bias can be programmed into a system. So your developers, your designers, your system architects, they may be using, things that they've learned 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years of experience. And certainly 30 years ago, we did not introduce ourselves with she, her, and hers, right? And certainly when we're thinking about those things, there can be bias that is programmed into a system based on gender, right? And we want to be aware of all those different things. There are also environmental concerns, like I talked about a little bit earlier. Think about the flooding that just happened in Kentucky. One of the things that a lot of the homeowners found is that their insurance did not cover their homes. And that was because when the actuarial risk was performed, they were designated to be in an area where there was a low incidence of flooding, right? Where there was a low risk of flooding. So some of these people lost everything because the algorithms did not take into account how the environment is changing. The same thing for, people who live in areas where there is a high risk for natural disasters like fires or wildfires or, tornadoes. We're having tornadoes and all sorts of different natural events that are happening in various places that we did not have before. And again, as insurance adjusters are considering the risk, some of those actuarial algorithms are not taking into consideration these environmental concerns. So again, when we're looking at the data, we do have to update our approach and take into consideration also things like behavior changes, right? So one of the things that, again, talking about insurance, we see is that with the airlines currently having all sorts of different challenges, more people are saying, well, you know what, I'll just drive. I'll drive to, this other state, and we'll take a road trip, or we will do something that's a little bit different. Oh man, let me look at the time. We'll do something that's a little bit different than we did in previous generations. Certainly, these factors are all need to be taken into consideration as we're talking about the fact that we've seen an increase in auto accidents over the last couple of years. So one of the things that we want to do is re-engineer the process. We want to, really look at things like when we're talking about recruiting, for instance, we want to look at representation as not only a key to us doing things differently, but also thinking about how our recruiting tools use algorithms to determine who is a qualified candidate. And one of the things, again, as I said a little bit earlier, is a lot of folks are excited about the new technologies and all the different bells and whistles that they have, but we don't understand the implications that those new technologies may have on different groups. We may not understand what questions to ask. And we also may forget about the fact that people are different. Case in point, whenever I go sometimes into my son's bathroom, I see that his toothbrush and soap are on the left-hand side of the sink versus the right-hand side. And I'm like, now who moved this? And I keep forgetting, he's 13 now, but I keep forgetting that he's right-handed, he's left-handed, and I'm right-handed, right? So we want to be able to think about all these different things. So one of the things that we want to do is really make it so that we can develop guidelines for ethical use and inclusion when it comes to coding, data sources, and transparency. So oftentimes when an organization finds that they have challenges in their system, one of the things that they'll do is they will want to hide it, right? I don't want people to know that we have some bias issues in here, right? And I'm not saying that you have to make it so that you do a whole press release about it and announce to the public, but you do need to ensure that people are talking about it. Thank you very much for that, Jenna. Coded bias. We want to make sure that people can, yes, and I'm going to make these slides available to you all. We want to make sure that people can talk about it in a transparent way. There was, I don't know if you all saw the case about the young man a couple of weeks ago who said that there was a system that he was using. He worked at an organization, and he said the system was starting to have feelings. And he said, this is really creepy. And everyone in the organization was uncomfortable, right? And I think they fired him because he made the announcement that there was, that this system had a creepy use of feelings, right? And certainly people were upset about that. This transparency issue is going to be important because people expect for there to be transparency. If you see something, you have to be able to say something and not to hide it. You're also going to have to combine data and analytics to improve your organization's insights, processes, and functions in different cultural contexts. So thinking about issues like neurodiversity, and that is the concept of people thinking different and processing information differently, and even interacting differently. We also want to think about the different cultural contexts in terms of intersectionality. So not just saying that I'm Latino, I may speak a different language, and I may be LGBTQIA. I may have some other cultural nuances that make me a unique user, right? Or a unique customer. We want to be able to think about the impact that a mega merger is going to have on our organization, right? So just thinking about Microsoft and how Microsoft purchased or was in the process of purchasing Activision, and Activision had all of those issues dealing with harassment rate in its workforce. And certainly as we are looking at all these different things, we will have to ensure that as there are mergers, that we are also at the table talking about these things that are going to be important. And certainly when it comes to updating our systems, we want to make it so that we can include processes for those virtual communication loops, and making it so that we are rethinking things like engagement, especially in this era where we have more people working at home. How is it that you're going to be able to test out your new system or pilot your system with all of the different users when we perhaps may have more people working from home? We also have layoffs and all sorts of changes in the organization. Just as we're talking about some of the things that we should do, we want to avoid some of these real life issues. So many of you have had to use CAPTCHA to verify that you're not a bot. And certainly with CAPTCHA, you may have to pick out all of the squares that have a bike, right? And one of the things that people found is that when using CAPTCHA, that there were some nuances when it came to people's ability. For instance, if I have a visual impairment, I may not be able to pick out all of the areas where there is a mountain or a crosswalk, right? There's another bias that was in CAPTCHA, and that is that some of the terms were American terms. So if you lived in the UK and you use a different term for perhaps offense, or you use a different term for perhaps a football stadium, the translation didn't go well. So a lot of organizations begin to say, okay, well, you know what? We've got to rethink this CAPTCHA. One of the other things that we've heard in recent years is the whole social media feed, and how for young people, Generation Z in particular, these algorithms determine what comes into your feed. So you may have, if you've looked up information on suicide, you will have a lot of posts coming into your feed that deal with suicide, right? And you may have other posts that contribute to a decline in mental health. So this has been a huge topic, and certainly overseas in other countries, we have had more nations saying, hey, you know what? You've got to reconstruct how this feed works. When it comes to facial recognition, what's interesting is facial recognition has not only caused problems for some police department where individuals were wrongly identified, but it has also caused problems for electric vehicles, where certain people, perhaps individuals with darker skin, especially at nighttime, would not be able to be recognized by the electric vehicles. So a lot of organizations have said, hey, we've got to stop using this facial recognition feature, especially when we're talking about people driving at night. Even in the metaverse, some of you may have heard about the young lady who was sexually assaulted, and there have been several different people that have reported sexual assaults in the metaverse. So these are all big PR disasters, right? And certainly as we're talking about all these different things, we have to really come to reckoning with the expectation that folks expect transparency today. They expect inclusion, they expect sustainability. And for this reason, diversity, equity, and inclusion is not going away. This is where we serve as that bridge to 21st century expectations. Certainly, one of the things that we want to do is make it so that we can get the right people on the bus. Not only will our workforce needs be different in the future, but it is also going to be necessary from a design perspective. We are going to need to have individuals who represent a variety of different identities, and they're going to have to be comfortable sharing those identities, because this is going to help us to inform our insights, right? So that we can use data sets that are valid and reliable, and ultimately making it so that we can think about this work from a different perspective. We also want to think about these unfair outcomes and errors. Algorithmic bias can be in recruiting and HR functions, everything from determining employee benefits. Yes, Jenna said sharing those identities willingly. Because again, if you don't have people sharing those identities willingly, you're not going to be able to utilize those individuals as resources, and allow those identities to produce value in your organization. Because again, you're going to find yourself in a situation like CAPTCHA, right? Where you're like, oh man, I didn't think about people with visual impairments or disabilities not being able to use CAPTCHA effectively, or people who are not Americans not being able to use CAPTCHA effectively. Certainly, we can have algorithmic bias in all sorts of different areas, everything from marketing and advertising, again, to social media and all sorts of other areas. But our voice is going to matter. I wanted to break out into breakout groups, and certainly I'm not going to be able to do that. But one of the things that I would like for you all to do is really talk about how you can communicate these challenges within your organization within the context of different scenarios. So generally, we teach in the CDE program that a scenario is one way that an event may unfold. But certainly in the context of the IT space, a scenario is going to provide the use case, which describes the different system interactions. And certainly we want to think about how we can get involved and communicate to people the need to learn these things before a purchase. Like, how do you ask the right questions? Here are some questions, here are some things that we should consider. But then when we're talking, not just before a purchase, but also as we're talking about the technology that we're currently using. Just about everything that our organizations do today involve some type of algorithms. So we have to begin to really not go into a room and say, hey, you all are doing this wrong, right? But make it so that we can really talk about these issues and get people to learn without them being on the defensive. And with that being said, the key to us really doing this well is being proactive and not just kind of reacting and saying, hey, we're going to come up with a fix, we're going to develop a patch, but making it so that we can, take the same I'll say perspective that is being used when we're talking about accessibility. All right. So, what are some of the key points that you got from our conversation? I know I ran out of time, but I will share some of these slides with you all. And certainly, I want you to begin thinking about this, talking about it, researching about this topic, and making it so that you can learn and practice talking about it and really taking this conversation to the next level. And certainly UX is usability, user experience, and certainly Veronica, she noted this is more prevalent than I thought. What else?
Leah, do you have any, or can you refer us to any research papers that address some of these issues? Because
Yes.
I currently deal with a lot of people who are DEI averse, I guess, and they think I'm just, yelling fire. And I always like to have something to back up what I'm saying. Like, for instance, the electric vehicles, putting your hands under the sink to get the water started. I have that problem all the time, but they think that I'm just. But so I like to have data
Yes.
to try to back that up.
Okay. I will get, when Amber sends out these slides, I'll make sure that we include some of the research reports.
Okay, thank you. And I love this information. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, anything else?
Yeah, I appreciate the point about the data analytics. My profession is the accounting industry, particularly public accounting. Accountants like numbers. And if there aren't numbers or analytics to back something up, they tend to discount it, dismiss it, or they just sort of brush it off. So it can be really challenging to have these conversations around. Once you start talking about inclusion and belonging, they get the diversity piece, but they don't understand the implications of it.
Right.
So this has been really helpful, and just thinking of other ways to frame that conversation.
Right. And part of it can be, using that data, but providing insight into the data. Like, not just assuming that they can read between the lines, because most of the time they can't read between the lines, because we know the data is there, but certainly they're just like, we don't know what this data means.
I really wish we could do the breakout groups, because I would love to hear stories from others. I don't know if anybody wants, or if you guys even have the time to stay after, and for those who can, and share stories that make this stuff come alive is when I think I've seen people take it out of the academic and think, oh, this is how it affects me, so I can see how it can affect my organization.
Right. And maybe Amber can schedule another time with everyone where we can do just have breakouts and just have, some conversations, and we can provide some talking points for the breakout groups so that you all can begin to kind of think about these things in a hands-on way.
Hi, this is Brandis. Sorry, Gina, which firm are you at?
Me? Oh, it's my own company, Etienne Consulting.
So okay.
I'm not in a firm. I try to get the firms to hire me.
Oh, yeah, because I was about to say some of the big four, they're really good and progressive. And if you want to go out and check out Diversity Inc., E&Y is really a good leader as far as what the accountant firms are doing around diversity. They tend to set the trend for that.
Yeah, there's a lot of great information out there. Thank you.
Okay. Amber? Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to share that something that I picked up from this is we're talking about, amongst other things, the algorithmic bias. And I was